like that's what stands behind my family. This acts is like it's this is what we know. This is what we got from my parents. I'm not proud of I'm not proud of myself for what I do. I'm proud of my parents to see their education,
The inspiration that they
The-
gave you, the path that they
like-
put you on.
because I know that that's what they want. That's what we do today. That's what my parents would ever want us to do. That's what they want to see their kids doing. And thanks God, it became a spot of showing it. Where our Instagram got a little bit famous and people seeing the world.
You got famous.
We got famous doing this. I thought I'll get famous from parties or from I don't know what.
But you got famous from
And
doing
you get
good.
famous from doing something good, which is, Baruch Hashem, it's incredible.
So a lot of people always talk about what happens after the war. People talk to politicians, to strategists, to consultants in government. What happens, the day after? What happens the day after the war ends? Where do you see Shuva Achim from 1, 2, 3 years down, or even months down? What do you do with Shuva Achim once the war ends? I'm sure there's always going to be, an IDF presence down south, and even more since October 7th. But where do you see the future going for Shuva Achim?
I really have no clue. I never thought I will be doing what I do now. And it's a part of my life to go with it. I tell you what, I told you how I was working in the restaurants before, and I was doing sales in America, and I was doing Mexico. And today I get to make food while selling what I do in English and in Spanish and hosting people like in Mexico. God took all of my life, all what I ever did in my life, and created a place that used all of me. So I believe that Shuva Achim is a preparation for something maybe bigger in the future. We are ready. We love our people. We love Am Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael, and we'll be here and standing for our people forever.
So you don't see you ever shutting down Shuva Achim. You see this as your life mission now.
I'm telling you, I'm saying about Shuva Achim that I feel like the last day it will go besara shamayma, like they say about Eliyahu Navi. It will just go somewhere because it's very divine. It's very divine. The things that are happening in Shuva, everyone who watched this show and been to Shuva can tell you of a Shuva magic that happened to him.
And how does this make your connection with your brothers, your feelings with your brothers who've been helping? You've been doing this from the beginning also. How did that build your love for each other, or where's your relationship with your brothers gone?
I can tell you that our family was never as united as now. Never. The whole family, everyone standing for everyone. Same with our friends, by the way. All the circles that are around us are very, very tight now. Everyone, like we just been to a weekend right now with all my family together. So really, really strong today, the connection. Thanks God.
Thank God is right. But when you're not there at Shuva, like if you went away with your family, if you're not there at Shuva, who's in charge? Who's running it? Do you have such a volunteer base now that you feel comfortable that it'll operate and continue if you don't show up?
You ask this question after getting me to Rishon LeZion at 10:30 a.m. Yes. Thanks God. Monday, I have Lilian. She's an 80-year-old Moroccan from Bat Yam that cooks 200 meals in our home, bringing it every Monday. So specifically Monday, I know I have few hours for myself in the morning, and I'm nothing gonna be bad.
Thank you to her for doing all that.
Yes, thank you, Lilian. We have Chen. I have some volunteers that I know that when they're there, I can actually even go for a bit, which is not happening very often. Whenever you came to Shuva, you saw me. But thanks God, I have my volunteers from the area or from Israel that are the ones, they're the ones that staying or coming back every time. And
you also became like on every tour guide's list, every tour guide going down south, showing, the visitors, the people, unfortunately, what happened in that area there. Everyone stops by Shuva Achim.
Yeah.
Everyone now.
If you remember, they used to call it Tayarut Shchol, like a bad, sad tourism, something like that. And then they understood that how much sad can you show our people? We're Jews. That's who we are. We celebrate Independence Day and Memorial Day on the same day. We know sad, but we know happy. And you show October 7th and what happened. You show the cars, you show the Nova, you show Sderot. But then you come to finish at Shuva and you show October 8th. You show hope. You show who are we as Am Yisrael, what we have to offer to the world, how we can lift our people with us and stand together, stand strong.
And
together.
what you're doing is bringing light unto the nation. You're bringing light to all the nations. You are such an amazing person. And Dor, I want to thank you so much for joining me here today on the Nash. It was a pleasure having you. You should continue being matzliach and hatzlach and bracha, which means doing good and having, great blessings and everything else. And I want to thank you and continue. And if you're here in Israel, you better go down to the community of Shuva by the Shuva Junction and go take a look at the Shuva Brothers, Shuva Achim, and see what they're doing. Volunteer, experience it today. I want to thank everybody for tuning in to another episode of The Nash here on ILTV, and we will be back. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Welcome back to ILTV on the Hour. I'm Madar Lazi, coming to you live from Israel with all of the latest headlines from across the region. Let's take a look at the latest developments. A very bloody 24 hours here in Israel as sirens have continued sounding this morning, warning of Iranian and Hezbollah missile attacks. Earlier this morning, sirens sounded in central Israel with multiple impact sites in Tel Aviv, Ramat Gan, and Petach Tikva. 15 people were injured, among them one in serious condition. And overnight, 100 people were injured in Iranian missile attacks in the southern cities of Dimona and Arad, 11 of them seriously, after air defenses failed to intercept at least 2 ballistic missiles. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu toured the impact site in Arad today. Let's listen to what he had to say.
אנחנו פה בערד, קרה פה נס, אבל נס שאפשר היה לחסוך אותו. הנס הוא שאף אחד לא נהרג, אנחנו כאן במאבק על הקיום. כל העם חזית, זה אומר שהעורף חזית. ואני מבקש מכם פעם נוספת ללמוד את הלקחים. מאז תחילת המלחמה, מאיראן, מטילי איראן, נהרגו 15 איש. כל אחד מהם עולם ומלואו. אנחנו מצירים, מבקים כל אחד ואחד מהם. מעבר לזה אנחנו ממשיכים להילחם בנחישות באויב, עושים את זה ביתר שאת עם ידידינו האמריקנים. אנחנו שותפים מלאים, אנחנו מכים בהם שוק על ירך ונמשיך לעשות זאת עד שנשיג את כל מטרותינו. אנחנו מבקשים לייצר את התנאים שיאפשרו לעם האיראני לפרוק את העול של העריצות הזאת. אנחנו עושים דברים רבים, פוגעים במשטר הזה, סודקים אותו, פוגעים בו בצורות שהוא אפילו לא שאר, ויש עוד עבודה לעשות. אני מקווה שנשיג ניצור את התנאים האלה שיאפשרו לשינוי משטר, אבל הגדרנו, אנחנו רוצים פשוט לרסק להם את תוכנית הגרעין, ואנחנו עושים את זה, לרסק להם את תוכנית הטילים, ואנחנו עושים את זה, לרסק להם את היכולת לייצר גרעין וטילים, ואנחנו עושים את זה, ועוד היד נטויה.
Meanwhile, in the north, Magen David Adom announced that one person has been killed in a Hezbollah missile attack on the community of Misgav Am. This marks the first Israeli fatality from Hezbollah rocket or missile fire since the start of hostilities on February 28th. And joining us now live from Jerusalem, where over the weekend a missile fragment hit the old city, is ILTV executive editor Mayan Hoffman. Mayan, thanks for joining us. It's been a really devastating 24 hours, attacks, injuries, and even one death from the north, as we heard. Can you give us the latest?
Yeah, Vidar. So as you were saying, it's already been quite an eventful day today. We've had one person killed this morning in the north of East Dam. His name is Ofer Markowitz. He has now been announced as the person who was killed. He was killed when an anti-tank missile was fired from Hezbollah into the northern communities. In addition to that, we had several sirens wail already throughout the day in central Israel. those sirens led to the injury of around 15 people. We saw direct strikes in areas that are quite populated, including a strike near the Ayalon major thoroughfare, our major highway. And this followed a weekend that was absolutely deadly, as you described, in the cities of Dimona and Arad, which are in southern Israel, areas which have been less hit up until now. We had 2 direct missile strikes. Now, I was on a briefing this morning with the IDF, and the spokesperson explained that these were standard missiles. These were the general ballistic missiles that we've seen launched until now. They're investigating what went wrong, because even though the IDF did try to shoot down those missiles, both of them fell. In Arad, we're talking about many, many apartment buildings that were destroyed. In Dimona, we're also talking about incredible direct hits. This is right near the nuclear facility. Also, the IAEA has said that there is no damage, no leakage or anything that happened from that. But of course, Iran said they were directly targeting that area in order to go after our nuclear facilities, following the attack by us in the United States against the Natanz nuclear facility in Iran. So it's really been a very heated weekend. And where I am right now, as you can see, maybe behind me, there's quite a bit of damage done here in the holy city of Jerusalem as well. Those are from missiles, that shrapnel, in fact, that fell on Friday.
So a lot, has happened over the weekend. You broke it down for us. I do want to talk for a moment about the missile strike that we saw just an hour ago in the center in Tel Aviv. We had multiple impact sites across the center, not just Tel Aviv, but in the surrounding vicinities, surrounding neighborhoods. Was that a cluster bomb used? Do we know as of now?
It is understood that it was likely a cluster bomb. In part of the briefing this morning, one of the things that they were talking about, the idea, was the fact that Iran, is firing less missiles than it did before, but is learned to make them even more deadly. Remember that cluster bombs are illegal. The only goal is to target civilians. Thus far, by in the West Bank, when an Iranian missile was shot over there to their neighborhoods in the West Bank. In addition to that, all of the Israelis, as you mentioned, Ms. Meow, said 15 Israelis up until now as well. And so, this is largely because of these cluster bombs. And cluster bombs are a lot less deadly and a lot less impactful in terms of the amount of damage that is done. We mentioned over 100 people in Iran and Dimona. The IDF made very clear that the people who were injured were people who were not in shelters. It is very, very important to go to your shelters. But these cluster bombs, what happens is the IDF shoots down the missile. Even though we have defense systems, the Iron Dome, that can get the bomblets, as we call them, the little missiles that come out of the larger missile head, it is much more difficult to do so. And these missiles tend to fall down and to damage property. It's more than anything. And then also, of course, kill. We saw in Rishon LeZion, we didn't talk about it on Friday, one of these little bomblets that fell onto a preschool. You can see the damage, that was caused over there. And if these kids had been in the school, just imagine how deadly that would be. The same thing here when you look behind me, knocking into a major sidewalk here in the Old City. Remember, this is just meters away from the Western Wall, the Temple Mount, some of the holiest sites in Israel being targeted by Iranian missiles.
So it does seem, let's pivot now to Jerusalem, where you are, because that was a very, very shocking visuals that we saw coming out of Jerusalem over the weekend. We saw this, big plume of smoke over the Old City, of course, the holy sites for Christianity, for Judaism, for Islam, all meters away from where you're standing. It seems that the Iranians are now perhaps trying to target these holy sites. This is a major escalation, because these sites really have been considered off limits until now. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, that's correct, Lidar. It's speculation as to whether or not they are purposely trying to target Jerusalem. I actually spoke offline to a couple of experts this morning to ask that exact question. And what I'm told is that there's a division of opinion. On the one hand, it looks like Iran is actually focusing a little bit on Jerusalem. I live here in this area, and through most of the escalations, especially in June, we saw a lot fewer rockets than what we saw targeted towards central Israel, the Tel Aviv and surrounding area. But this time around, there's been many, many more, including last week when some shrapnel also fell in East Jerusalem, fell on the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Right now, again, the church is closed because of the restrictions. But again, we're heading into Easter. It's the time for the Holy Fire ceremony, when many, many people would be gathering there in that church where shrapnel fell. And over here too, I mean, you would be talking about hitting the Western Wall or the Temple Mount, which is the holiest place in Islam. The question is, why would they be targeting sites like this when they know what it would mean to their own people? It's really a question mark. And one other side of the coin is that, in fact, because of the damage, the IDF is saying that Iran has targeted us with 400 missiles. We have had a 92% success rate in combating those missiles. And the majority of the missiles that are being sent, we have demolished around 70% of the launcher capabilities. But remember, they had 2,500 rockets. And if they've only fired 400, there are many more rockets to go. Of course, they fire some at the Gulf, of course, around areas. But you have to imagine that they have at least about half of their arsenal left. And that is going to continue to be targeted here. And right now, Iran is not strategic necessarily, as we might, on the one hand, people say maybe. On the other hand, it seems that the majority of the missiles are just being shot at Israel to terrorize the people, these cluster bombs to, make the civilians suffer and to cause damage to our property and our lives, sending millions of people into bomb shelters every day.
The last 24 hours and over the weekend. Thank you, Mayan, for the update.
Thank you.
And meanwhile, emergency services continue to respond across the country as missile threats persist into the fourth week of the war with Iran. And joining us now with more on how Israeli municipalities are dealing with the strikes is Israel Zari, Vice Mayor of Ramat Gan. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So Ramat Gan was just hit today, a short while ago. Can you give us an update on any damages or injuries in the city?
Yes, of course. But at first, I want to send my support and encouragement to the city of Arad. Yesterday, she got really heavily hit from an Iranian missile there. And I just want to send really big support from Ramat Gan and to wish all just be well and feel well as soon as possible.
Yeah. And so what can you tell us about the hit today in Ramat Gan?
Actually, today hit was one of the easiest comparing to the other days, because for the past 3 weeks, we got more than 44 hit by missiles here in Ramat Gan. We can also talk about the buildings, because more than 20 buildings in Ramat Gan were hit and people actually losing their home. That's the thing that I find the more and much harder thing to look, because when I come to an area, when I see a person who lost everything, I just can't compare this feeling to nothing else.
Absolutely. And, Ramat Gan also received a very hard hit last week. A couple in their 70s were killed in their apartment from an Iranian missile. The city is continuing to come under fire. So, what is the atmosphere like in the city? What is the feeling today?
I must say that the feeling is good, because we are a very, very strong nation, and Ramat Gan is part of a state that got so many hits for the past 3 years. So when you walk in Ramat Gan, you feel people who understand what we're fighting for. And when you go to the light rail station, you see people sleeping on mattresses, because they understand they are in a war that's supposed to determine our place in the Middle East. So I can't say it's easy, because a lot of friends were hit, or their home got hit, or they lost someone who were familiar with in the past 3 years. So it's not easy, but you can feel the spirit here in Ramat Gan is strong, because we are, as a municipality, we all the time need to encourage them and to help them. And we have so many volunteer people. So the atmosphere is good, but it's thanks to the Israeli atmosphere.
And when you understand that a missile strikes in your city, what happens from that moment?
In that moment, everyone is coming to the area, but I'm talking about the municipality team, and I'm also talking about the emergency team. They know, they work for it for a long time, and they're coming to the area, they close it, they start to look very deeply and very sensitive, in very much of sensibility, to understand who is in the building, what happened, who needs help first, because you need to classify it and you need to know who is there. We have fire department who are going straight to the area, and Actually, each area is very, very different. So this is what happened when the couple got hit, and that's what happened in the last time.
And you mentioned so many people who are now basically don't have homes. They've lost everything, their entire life, essentially, all their belongings. What happens to those people? They're relocated. Where do they go, and what does the municipality do to help them?
So the municipality has evacuated them to hotels because we feel they need to get the best place after getting this serious hit. And we are going there day by day, checking for them, and we help them with things that even are irrelevant to their home because we want to make them feel as good as possible. And in the meantime, we start to really maintain their places. Sometimes we need just to fix the windows, but sometimes it's to make a new building. And it's something that happened here in Ramat Gan.
Yeah, and we're seeing some of the footage right now from the missile strike this afternoon in Ramat Gan and in Tel Aviv on the screen. And I do also want to talk a little bit about, maybe if you have some of the numbers off the top of your head, I'm not sure if you do, but how many people in Ramat Gan as of today have been relocated from their homes?
Close to 100 people from these 3 weeks. Actually, for the past 3 months, I'm talking about more than 4,000. But from the past 3 weeks, we have 100 people who got evacuated to hotels.
And I do also want to talk to you about the children, about schools, because I know that a school was also hit in Ramat Gan last week, and luckily no children were inside. But what is the situation with schools and, children in most of Israel, and especially in Ramat Gan and Tel Aviv and the central areas, are still learning on Zoom? Is there an expectation of when they will reopen?
Sadly, no, because a lot of cities were supposed to come back today. But after the missile got hit in kindergarten yesterday, I think no parent feeling safe to send their kids to the education system. But actually, you touched the spot that I think it's so crucial because that's what I'm worried about the most. I'm worried for this generation, that is not going to education system properly, that is not knowing when it can feel safe for the next time. And we try to take care for this generation, but by encourage them to go to volunteer work. So we see the Scouts movement, and we see a lot of people in those ages that come and help for the elderlies and help for each other, because this generation needs to get our support because the education system is closed for a long time and we can't tell when it's coming back.
Absolutely. I think that's such an important point, that the rest of the world essentially went back to normal after, let's say, the coronavirus pandemic and learning on Zoom. But children here in Israel since really October 7th, 2023 have been sort of in an up and down roller coaster, emotional roller coaster, with schools opening and closing because of the war. So really, as you mentioned, a key and very important point. And of course, there's no expectation of when they will reopen now.
I'm in charge of youth for the past 7 years in Ramat Gan. And I think for 7 years, there's no time that they felt safe or they felt like something stable. And I'm so sorry for this because this generation needs to know something else. And actually, this is what this war is about, to make this generation feel safe, feel like it can be, to live as a Jew in Israel should be something that is for granted. And in these days, this generation doesn't feel it, sadly.
Absolutely. Very unfortunate, sort of, for the children especially, as you said. Israel Zari, thank you so much for joining us today.
I want to thank you, and I also want to thank Mayor Carmen Shama Cohen for leading this town in such a hard time. And I wish all cities could act like Ramat Gan and really see their citizens as Ramat Gan does.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And it's day 23 of the war with Iran. Over the past hours, the IDF conducted waves of airstrikes in Tehran and western Iran. The IDF says Israeli Air Force jets hit dozens of sites linked to Iran's ballistic missile program, including IRGC complexes, missile fuel facilities, component factories, and air defense systems. Targets east of Tehran included storage sites for ballistic missile launchers where operatives were present. The IDF says it had identified Iranian operatives preparing missile launches. Earlier, the IDF says the Israeli Air Force struck a nuclear weapons research and development facility in Tehran. The target was located within Malik Ashtar University, which the IDF says was used to develop both nuclear weapons components and ballistic missiles. The IDF also said Israeli Air Force jets carried out a wave of strikes in Tehran, targeting dozens of sites linked to Iran's ballistic missile program. IDF Chief of Staff Lieutenant General Eyal Zamir said that the military is about halfway through its campaign against Iran, with the direction clear as operations continue towards Passover. In a video statement, Zamir says weeks of strikes are now producing systemic strategic gains, weakening Iran's military, economy, and leadership. Zamir also warned that Iran's long-range missiles reach far beyond Israel, citing a strike toward Diego Garcia and noting European capitals like Berlin, Paris, and Rome are now within range. Let's hear what he had to say.
איראן שיגרה טיר בליסטי בין יבשתי, דו-שלבי, לטווח של 4,000 קילומטרים לעבר מטרה אמריקאית באי דייגו גרסיה. טילים אלו לא נועדו לפגוע בישראל. הטווח שלהם מגיע לבירות אירופה. ברלין, פריז ורומא, כולן נמצאות בטווח איום ישיר. למדנו מההיסטוריה העולמית והיהודית שהכחשת איום או התרפסות בפניו לא מעלימה אותו. להפך, היא מקרינה חולשה ומדרבנת משטרים קיצוניים.
And meanwhile, U.S. President Donald Trump is threatening to obliterate Iran's power plants if Iran does not fully reopen the Strait of Hormuz within 48 hours. In a social media post overnight, Trump warned the U.S. will strike major energy infrastructure, marking a sharp escalation just one day after he spoke about winding down the war. U.S. warplanes and attack helicopters have intensified strikes on Iran's drones, naval vessels, and coastal facilities in a push to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, a key global energy route. Now, CENTCOM Commander Brad Cooper says U.S. forces have eliminated over 8,000 targets, including 130 Iranian vessels, dealing what he calls the largest naval blow since World War II. Reports also indicate the U.S. struck the Natanz nuclear enrichment facility, using bunker buster bombs to disrupt Iran's nuclear program. The IDF says it did not conduct any strikes in Natanz and cannot comment on U.S. actions. And in a major development, as we heard from the IDF Chief of Staff, Iran fired 2 ballistic missiles at the UK-US base on Diego Garcia. The attack failed, but the launch strike demonstrated Iran's missile range can now reach European cities. Now, according to President Trump's statement on Truth Social, the U.S. is, quote, very close to meeting objectives in Iran, including degrading missile capabilities, destroying defense industrial bases, eliminating Navy and Air Force assets, and preventing Iran from obtaining nuclear capability. He urged countries using the Strait of Hormuz to police it themselves, saying the U.S. will help if needed, but will not take primary responsibility on this after, in an earlier post, he called his NATO allies cowards. And so joining us now with the latest on Operations Roaring Lion and Operation Epic Fury are Jonathan Chanzer, Executive Director of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and Azriel Berman, Senior Researcher at the Institute of International Relations in Prague. Thank you both for joining.
Pleasure.
So, Jonathan, let's start with you. U.S. President Donald Trump has now given Iran an ultimatum. Open the Strait of Hormuz or else face obliteration of its energy infrastructure. What do you make of this threat?
Well, obviously, it's a serious escalation in rhetoric. I think the president is probably still very not enthusiastic about escalating the war to target energy, given the fact that we already have an energy crisis. We've already seen the price of oil, the price of natural gas skyrocket. We've seen the stock market begin to tremble a bit. So this is exactly what he didn't want to have to do. But I think we get a sense here that the Islamic Republic is not backing down, and that the president has to figure out a way to threaten them in ways that perhaps get them to rethink their entire strategy. Although I believe right now that the Islamic Republic understands that it is in an existential battle. This is not just about getting them to end their nuclear program or their missile program or their proxy program. I think they understand that this is an effort at the end of the day for regime change. It's what the Israeli government has said. It's not exactly what Donald Trump has said, but I think we can read between the lines and we can hear the mood music. So I think we're going to see continued escalation on the part of the regime. For me, the big question is whether the United States can declare that its military objectives have been met and to stand down in the Gulf. And then what happens? Does the Islamic Republic ease tensions in the Strait of Hormuz, or do they maintain it? If they do, then it will not be easy for the United States to walk away, even after they've declared that most of their objectives, if not all of them, have been met.
Mm-hmm. And Azriel, I want to pose the same question to you, what you make of Trump's ultimatum, because just one day before, it sounds, he said, he wants the war to wind down, or he's considering winding down this war. It doesn't sound as if the war is winding down. What are your thoughts?
It doesn't sound, but we were dealing with a very unpredictable president who will do what he thinks is right for him at a particular moment. And let's be honest with ourselves here. This is not going well for the president. I mean, the Iran is in a weak position. It's been battered and bruised, but it knows that the United States has a vulnerability by striking out at U.S. allies in the Gulf and restricting movement in the Straits of Hormuz. This is damaging energy supplies, damaging the U.S. economy, in truth also potentially creating schisms within the Republican Party, so the president has a dilemma, and at the same time, there are clear differences between the Americans and the Israelis. I mean, the United States, it could decide at this point, Trump could decide to declare victory on the basis of the fact that the supreme leader and the elite, the leadership within Iran has been decimated. And the nuclear program has been degraded, although the threat remains. In fact, in some degree, the threat is actually could be more severe because of the 440 kilograms that still haven't been. We're not entirely sure what has happened to that, and I'll come to that later. But Donald Trump has less. It's less of a risk for Trump to walk away than it is for Netanyahu. But certainly, if the United States President Trump could still decide at this point that that at this point he can declare victory, but for Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu, he's in a very, very difficult position because he has not achieved his strategic objectives.
Mm-hmm. And Jonathan, as Azriel just mentioned, we did hear this past week that U.S. and Israeli objectives for this war are not the same. President Trump made a statement to that effect as well. Now, should Trump decide to end this war prematurely, would he allow Israel to continue on its own? Would Israel continue on its own?
Look, first, I think I probably disagree to at least some extent with this notion that the U.S. and Israeli objectives are not the same. I think they will diverge, and there will be a moment where they do. But I think at the moment, they are 100% the same. They want to degrade all of Iran's strategic weaponry. They want to degrade and destroy the nuclear program. They want Iran to not be a threat to the entire Middle East. In other words, to Israel, but also to all the Gulf states. That is what this effort is about, and I think that they're going to continue to fight shoulder to shoulder until there is a fork in the road. When that fork arrives, that's, I think, the big question. And there, I think, we still don't know exactly what the plan is of the United States and Israel for what we might call phase two. In other words, you have the major military operations that are ongoing right now. After that comes the question of, can there be the engineering of a regime change? I don't believe that you can bomb a country into regime change. It's possible, but I'm not sold on it. In other words, you bomb them until somebody says, okay, white flag, I'm gonna just give up, and we're going to agree to have some kind of new pragmatic leadership. I don't believe that that's going to happen in Iran. I think the regime is too ideological. However, I do believe that when the bombing stops, there will be opportunities for the Mossad, for the CIA, if they choose to join, Saudi intelligence, Azerbaijan's intelligence. I mean, look, all of the Arab states right now want this regime to go down. And that means that we're likely going to see weapons and cash and intelligence and other means coming in across the Iranian porous borders, providing support to the people of Iran. Now, that to me, that actually is probably the biggest black box in all of this. Are the people of Iran organized? Are they unified? Are they able to identify leaders who are willing to identify themselves and to begin to fight the Islamic Republic? And then on top of that, I think that is the question that you asked is the big one. Will the Israelis provide some kind of air support? Will there be drones? Will there be some kind of aircraft or something on the ground that helps the Iranian people stay organized and stay focused to bring down the regime? But I believe that the big drama, as much drama as we've seen over the last 3+ weeks, I think the real drama comes when the bombs stop.
Absolutely. And, Azriel, I do want to follow up on that point, because at the beginning of this war, we really saw, both Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump speak very clearly about the possibility of regime change in recent weeks or days. We haven't heard so much talk of this, especially from President Trump. It seems that there's sort of less, the rhetoric or the tone has shifted a little bit about the confidence in being able to see regime change through. So what is the latest analysis in your view on whether it will be possible to bring about regime change at the end of the day?
Well, first of all, I agree with what Jonathan said, that you can't bring regime change through bombing. You can't, that's. So I agree that we'll have to wait and see what happens when the war ceases, and see if it brings out the level of protests we saw a few months ago. My concern, though, is that by attacking strategic infrastructure, not of the regime, but of something that serves the Iranian public as a whole, this could be seen as a war not against the regime, but against the Iranian people. And that really worries me, because then you lose the hearts and minds. The whole point of this was, let's remember when President Trump said that the United States would step in and come to the rescue of the protesters. But I worry that in fact this could actually backfire very badly, with a lot of people, including those who were desperate to see the back of this regime. They could actually end up seeing the Israelis and Americans, as an enemy, and that is a source of grave concern. But of course, we don't know for sure, and I suspect that it's very much right now. Will still be many Iranians who are perhaps supportive of what is being done, but many who were previously desperate to see the end of the regime, who may now perhaps feel differently.
And Jonathan, I do want to go back to this point on the Strait of Hormuz. President Trump has shown a major spotlight on his NATO allies in dealing with the reopening of the strait. He called them cowards in a recent post and called on them to come in and help secure the strait. Are they going to join this war or this effort to open the strait? I mean, what is the latest word on their involvement?
Well, I mean, we continue to see, I think, a lot of countries on the fence. Look, the problem is right now that the mood music leading into this crisis was not great between our European allies here in the United States and our NATO allies. It's not been great. I mean, the Greenland crisis in particular did not set the tone for these countries wanting to join the United States in a war of this nature. I think there's also now the added fear that some of these European countries are going to feel. And I think this was absolutely a strategic decision by the Islamic Republic when they fired that long distance missile at Diego Garcia. It was a clear message to the Europeans that if they do join this battle, that they could be hit. And we now know that the regime has the ability to hit as far as Western Europe. So yes, they're nervous. But let me just say that the longer the energy crisis persists, the harder it's going to be for them to not join. As much as they may not like Donald Trump personally, I do believe that it is going to be in their national interest to make sure that the Strait of Hormuz remains open. As Donald Trump has said time and again, we here in the United States, I think something like 1% of our oil comes from the Strait of Hormuz. So many more European countries are highly, highly dependent upon oil coming out of this strategic choke point. It's going to be hard for them to ignore it. But I think there needs to be some kind of a reset, a kind of a diplomatic understanding between these European countries and the United States. Right now, we don't have that. And so there's a diplomatic dance that needs to take place in order to align forces and to move forward. But I do get the sense that the Europeans are saying, look what you started. And now you're asking us to get into this. And so you're asking us to pay a bill that, you know, you're still paying in part, but you're asking us to cover some of it. But I think what they need to understand is that they've been sitting on the fence for far too long. The Europeans have been bystanders, by and large, since this war began on October 7th. And let's be realistic about when the war began. Iran's fingerprints were on it from the beginning. We've watched the Middle East shudder and go through all sorts of convulsions. Since October 7th, the Europeans have sat us on the sidelines. I do believe that the time is rapidly approaching where they're going to have to pick a side. They don't like it, but just because you don't like it doesn't mean it's reality.
Absolutely. And I think that argument perhaps could have been relevant until we saw this launching of the ballistic missile that now could very well reach pretty much every major European city. So Azliel, I mean, following up on what Jonathan said, what is Europe's stance on this? I mean, they are now clearly, they could become the next target of the Islamic regime.
Well, first of all, the point about Trump's attacks on Europe and NATO countries. Well, I can fully understand why these countries would not want to help the United States. I mean, look at his. First of all, as Jonathan mentioned, Greenland. The fact that President Trump is contemptuous, he's scornful of NATO, of his European allies, and why the hell would they do anything to help Trump out? I mean, at the end of the day, Trump is in a mess of his own making, and we need to remember something very important here. Look at Denmark. We had the Americans making very demeaning remarks about Denmark, where this is a country that was one of the earliest countries to come to the aid of the United States in Iraq and also in Afghanistan. And the highest number of Denmark was among the highest number lost more soldiers, I think, of its proportion of its population than any other country. And what did Denmark get in return? It got insults from Trump. So even if the Europeans were to help out, I don't believe for 1 second that Trump would appreciate it, would show any gratitude. So I think he gets what he deserves, quite honestly. And as for the threat, Iran's threat to Europe, I think this is a little overblown. I mean, I've been writing about Iran and about the threat of its missiles to Europe for some years now. NATO, the Obama administration back in 2009 announced a NATO missile defense system to protect European countries from the threat of Iranian missiles, from the threat of potential missiles carrying nuclear warheads. So that threat has been, this is a threat that has been in the air for some time. Iran had already tested, for example, the Khorramshahr missile in around 2018, a missile which potentially can reach parts of France, for example. Certainly, it already has missiles for some years now. It has missiles that could reach parts of southern Europe. So, the threat is there. But the fact is, European countries, Germany, for example, purchased Israel's Arrow 3 system. Finland has purchased Israel's David Sling, but not because of a threat from Iran. They're worried about the Russians. The Russian threat is far more dangerous, if we're honest, than the Iranian threat. And that is the threat that really matters to Europeans. And I think Israel, when you have someone like IDF Chief of Staff talking about the Iranian threat to Europe, well, something, yes, there is a threat, but I think it's shows a certain lack of understanding of what really worries the Europeans. If you look at Central Europe, Eastern Europe, the Baltic states, they are worried stiffer. They're worried about Russia, which is, we see what Russia is doing in Ukraine, and that is for Europeans the biggest threat, not the Iranian threat, not Iran.
I would argue that, you could have more than one threat, as we know all too well here in Israel, multiple fronts, of course.
Israel has been nowhere in showing sympathy for this threat that Europeans are worried about. So, and to some degree has even appeased the Russians, has appeased Putin during the Ukraine war. So I think when Israelis claim that Europeans are appeasing Iran, you should remember that Israel has to some degree also been appeasing Russia.
Well, that is a completely different topic that can be debated on. But I do want to pivot now to Jonathan. We're also hearing reports that over 2,000 U.S. Marines are actually on their way to the Middle East right now. And so I want to ask what you make of this. And if you believe the U.S. or, the Trump administration is perhaps laying the foundation, maybe even slowly preparing the public for some kind of potential, ground operation in Iran.
Well, I think that is what people are talking about right now. As I understand it, there's an additional 2,000 on top of the 2,500 Marines that were deployed. So I guess 5,000 called up, give or take, over the last couple of weeks. And that's in addition to all the different warfighters that are already in theater. And I think the total number starts to creep up to close to 50,000, which will certainly make isolationists within the Republican Party unhappy and uncomfortable. And I'm sure we'll be hearing more about that, especially as the cost of the war goes up, and especially as the energy costs, natural gas, oil, etc. Those are the things that are going to create jitters. I think, though, that the president is going to be very careful about widespread ground forces. I think he understands that there's going to be limitations to the war that he wants to fight. Now, the war that you want to fight is not always the fight that you're going to, and I think there is always the threat of mission creep. Obviously, presidents past have dealt with this same problem in the Middle East as they've struggled to contain some of the malign forces in the region, including Iran, in other countries such as Iraq or Afghanistan. And so we've watched other presidents have to deploy more forces in order to try to get a handle on things. I think the key for Donald Trump is to figure out ways to fight smart, to fight with minimal forces. Whether he's able to, that's the big question. But I do think that one gets a sense across the Middle East right now, and it's the United States, but it's also the Gulf countries, it's certainly Israel. People understand that right now this regime is weaker than it's ever been. It doesn't mean that it's on the verge of complete collapse, but that there is a generational opportunity here to right-size the power of the regime in Iran. And I think that is really what the president's looking at right now. We know that he's hearing from certain voices in the region and from his own party to curb this before it gets too big, before it widens too far. But there are others who are also saying, look, we're actually making progress. Look at the nuclear program. Look at the missile program. Look at the weakness of the proxies. Look at the weakness of the regime. So there's some big choices ahead for Donald Trump.
Absolutely. Well, I could continue talking to you both for another hour, but unfortunately we're out of time. Jonathan Schanzer and Azriel Belmont, thank you both so much for joining us today.
Thank
My
you.
pleasure.
And moving on to the northern front, the war with Hezbollah in Lebanon is intensifying, with an additional IDF division now preparing for possible deployment. Over the weekend, the Air Force completed waves of airstrikes in Beirut and other locations, hitting central Hezbollah headquarters. There are currently 4 IDF divisions operating in southern Lebanon, and a 5th has completed the preparations for possible deployment as Israel moves to expand its buffer zone against Hezbollah. And in southern Lebanon, soldiers from the Givati Infantry Brigade killed armed Hezbollah terrorists in close quarters combat. Additional terrorists were struck by Israeli Air Force strike and tank fire. No Israeli forces were injured. And amid the warfare, the U.S. ambassador to Lebanon praised President Joseph Aoun's push for negotiations, saying issues cannot be resolved without dialogue, though it remains unclear if talks will move forward as the war intensifies. And so joining us now with the latest on the Northern Front is Dr. Barak Books, the Patterson Chair in Security and Intelligence and a lecturer in the Political Studies and School of Communications at Bar-Ilan University. Barak, always wonderful to have you on.
Thank you so much.
So right now, the question on everyone's mind is how likely is it that Israel will indeed expand its ground operation into Lebanon? We're seeing tanks amassing at the border in the past 24 hours and additional IDF troops being prepared to go in. What can you tell us?
I've been monitoring Lebanese media. They're under tremendous pressure. I can quote Al Jadid TV. They tweeted some text with picture of Security Minister Katz, saying that the Litani bridges in the southern villages are like Rafiah and Bet Hanun in Gaza. And there are reports also of the Lebanese army, what remained of it in South Lebanon, being evacuated from the Kasmiya region, Burj Rahal, and in the coastal roads. Meaning that South Lebanon is gradually becoming a belt of fire, and in a very justified manner, because today they killed the spokesperson of Misgav Am, Ofer Moskovich Hashem Yikom Damo, which was also the spokesperson. He was a farmer that stayed in his land and grew avocados, and he wanted to be there, and there is a tremendous price. They literally bombed the whole north constantly.
And you know, it's interesting because we heard that Hezbollah was largely destroyed after, nearly 2 years of fighting with Israel. We saw, and I'll remember, of course, the Pagers operation and many other operations. Now, since the ceasefire, they've clearly spent this time to rebuild and to rearm. And so, despite, Israelis, the IDF continuing to bomb Hezbollah targets in Lebanon, the ground forces now going into Lebanon, they still have the capacity to fire rockets into northern Israel, and as you mentioned, killed one person overnight. So what is your assessment of their capabilities now?
First of all, we have to learn from mistakes. We have to admit that. There had been an agreement since December 2024, and the Lebanese army had made tremendous shows and reports, and even brought diplomats to see how much did they worked. Even they produced numbers, as I quoted in previous interviews here, hundreds of rocket shells and tunnels, etc. It seems that the Lebanese army did some work, but the question is how much in relation to what was over there. Hezbollah probably was not touched or harmed in the central and northern parts of Lebanon, and probably continued to work and prepare for a war. We see this now. The thing is, the French government is, let's say, almost pleading to go to Paris and continue with the peace talks in Paris or ceasefire talks. And Hezbollah, surprisingly or not, they want the ceasefire from December 2024, but Naim Qassem, the Secretary General, he has the nerves to say that he wants to reopen some restrictions that Hezbollah had. Us in Israel, we have to see what happens now, learn from mistakes. We have to say that. And first of all, defend all of our civilians in the north and make sure that Hezbollah cannot continue like that anymore.
And, I do want to ask, because Hezbollah, of course, is an Iranian terror proxy. We see the war going on in Iran. Should the regime fall Can Hezbollah survive on its own?
I think it will want to continue, and I, in a previous interview, let's say, widen on that. Psychologically, Lebanon is not psychologically, but Lebanon is built on religion, sects, and inside honorable families. Hezbollah in the 50 years ago did not have any power. They were the servants of the affluence of Beirut, and now they run the country literally. In their eyes, psychologically, rearming them or giving up the weapons is going back on a bad memory lane 50 years ago. They cannot and will not want to do that. Now, in Lebanon, and I said that in the previous interview, the head of the army said that the solution is political. Maybe there can be a political solution, but the solution may be in the structure that I said a moment ago. Go to affluent families that may, some of them, resent as much as all the Lebanese population, Hezbollah's service of Iran and not Lebanon.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, what are Israel's options now, essentially? Because we know that Israel is pushing farther and farther into Lebanon, but it's still south of the Litani River. And as you mentioned, Hezbollah has been rebuilding and rearming north of the Litani River. So what are Israel's options as well in terms of this new diplomatic solution that seems to be on the table?
I think a joint operation, meaning the IDF had operated throughout all of these years in the ceasefire agreement by holding some points in South Lebanon and bombing Hezbollah factories and concentrations and commanders, even in Beirut throughout all of this time. Israel should continue, first of all, to defend its own security. Secondly, we can see that there is an agreement with President Giuliani's government and the Lebanese government and military to operate against Hezbollah. Let them do the work, but we have to do our work in order to defend our citizens. It is a combined venture, let's say.
And do you believe that we could possibly take a diplomatic approach here? That Hezbollah would be willing to disarm, would be willing to, lay down its arms, or will Israel have no choice but to go into Lebanon, a full ground invasion? I mean, there doesn't really seem to be many options on the table at the moment.
Listen, Lidar, a full ground invasion equivalently to 1982 is something all of us have to consider, because in 82 we entered Lebanon in peace for Galilee, but we had free Lebanon in South Lebanon under Major Said Haddad, who was an ally of Israel. We had a great Christian power under Bashir Jumayel, who was assassinated. So we had allies inside Lebanon. Now a full ground invasion is without all of these allies, as there are many, many forces that oppose Hezbollah. I think it is a parallel solution, meaning we have to operate, we have to think on each and every act that we do before we operate, and equivalently, let those forces that oppose Hezbollah, and I'm repeating again, Shiites like Amal movement, which are not of Lamed Vav Tzadikim, but they have their interests against Hezbollah, and Shiite families that following 30 years of Hassan Nasrallah may be, let's say, with grievances and bad feelings of not getting their share of the pie. All of this and all of them and us have to work, I'm not saying together, but with the same common denominator of compelling Hezbollah. They will not will. Compelling Hezbollah to disarm.
Absolutely. So a lot of work still ahead on the northern front for Israel. Dr. Barak Books, thank you so much for sharing your unique expertise with us today.
Thank you. May we have a quiet day.
Let's hope that we will continue to have a quiet day after the last 24 hours, a very bloody 24 hours. Now turning to Gaza, where the IDF targeted 4 armed Hamas terrorists in the northern Gaza Strip. The combat teams identified the terrorists in 2 separate incidents in the Yellow Line area where they posed an imminent threat to IDF soldiers. Meanwhile, a Gaza diplomatic update. The Trump Board of Peace has presented Hamas with a new detailed plan to disarm, a potential step towards a lasting ceasefire. Under the U.S.-backed proposal, Hamas and other groups would gradually hand over heavy weapons and provide maps of their tunnel networks, while Israeli forces would withdraw from the Strip. Now, talks took place in Cairo between Board of Peace official Nikolai Mladenov and senior Hamas officials. Sources say key details remain unclear, but disarmament has been a major sticking point since the October ceasefire, with U.S. and Israeli officials insisting Gaza's reconstruction depends on Hamas laying down its arms. And so joining us with the latest on Gaza and the Board of Peace proposal is Lieutenant Colonel Advocate Maurice Hirsch from the Jerusalem Center for Security and Foreign Affairs. Maurice, thank you for joining us.
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks for having me.
So the world has shifted its focus to Iran, but Gaza and Hamas are still very much an active front. What can you tell us about what is happening in Gaza today and how Hamas has perhaps used this distraction, this war with Iran, to rebuild its capabilities during this ceasefire period?
So really what we've seen over the last period, definitely since the war started, is an intensification of the efforts that Hamas had already put underway since the ceasefire started to regain its control, whether it's a security control with Hamas terrorists patrolling the streets, armed, and really enforcing the law. And then also at the same time, commandeering and making sure that they control the movement of any of the humanitarian aid going into the Gaza Strip. This then really rehabilitates both their governance and their security capabilities. And this is what we've been seeing during the war. It's only intensified while everyone else is looking towards Iran. Hamas is looking inwardly to make sure that it is already setting these facts on the ground, whilst all the time ensuring that there is no other opportunities for moving forward. They have no intention of disarming whatsoever. That is really a red herring. It's been a red herring all the way through, and it's something which they will never agree to.
And so what do you make of the new proposal by the Board of Peace?
So I think the Board of Peace is really trying to push forward on this subject to show progress, to show that there is another option for the Gaza Strip. I think Hamas's response to the initial document is very telling. On the one side, they said, well, this is a take it or leave it document, which they reject. They're not going to be dictated the terms of their surrender. This is something that they will continue to push to negotiate. On the other hand, they said, well, we're not going to wait. We're not going to give an answer until we've seen the outcome of the war with Iran. Obviously, that will have a great effect on what happens with Hamas if they lose their patrons, both in Tehran, their support from Hezbollah, and really their support from the global proxies of Iran. Then obviously that will put them in a weaker position, and they will have to really reassess how they address the options on the table. But if Iran manages to survive and manages to continue on funding the proxies and possibly even upgrading their involvement, then that's something that we'll also have to see. Qatar is also part of this deal. How will Qatar respond? Qatar, if we remember, made some type of voices at the beginning of the war once they were attacked by Iran, that they would expel the Hamas leadership from Doha. They have not moved forward on that in any way, shape or form. And so that's one of the other really parts of the equation that will need to be taken into account. And Hamas is following them all very, very carefully.
Now, do you think that after seeing the U.S. and Israeli operations in Iran, in Lebanon, seeing the level of destruction, Hamas would reconsider and would willingly disarm? Or do you believe that ultimately Israel will have no choice but will have to conclude this war with Iran and re-enter Gaza to disarm Hamas?
I think if we look at what's happened until now on the Iranian front, they were given every single option possible just to say we're not going to develop nuclear weapons to destroy America and Israel. They chose the violence and terrorism. Hezbollah was given every single option to really take the ceasefire after being decimated by a year and a half of fighting with Israel. They chose violence and destruction. Hamas is no different. Hamas has that part of their charter, part of their DNA is the destruction of Israel, and they will not give up on their weapons. They will not give up on that drive to destroy Israel. They will possibly say we'll give up on some of our assets, but keeping the others. They claim that they need some weapons in order to defend themselves against the PLO, the PA forces that might come in, considering what they did in 2007 to the Fatah forces, to the PLO forces, PA forces, throwing them off the tops of buildings. They will maintain their weapons. They will not give up all of the details of their very, very extensive tunnel program. And eventually someone else will have to go in and do that work, whether it's the International Stabilization Force, which I am skeptical whether they will actually take up arms against Hamas, or eventually Israel, as I see the only real option. That will come sooner or later. At the moment, obviously, there are bigger problems to deal with.
Absolutely. So still a very long road ahead for Gaza and for peace in the Middle East. Lieutenant Colonel Advocate Maurice Hirsch, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And that's a wrap for this edition of ILTV on the Hour, broadcasting live from Israel and the heart of the Middle East. We're here every hour on the Hour with the latest breaking developments, in-depth reports, and exclusive insights into the stories shaping the region and the world. Stay with us throughout the day for our next edition of ILTV on the Hour. We'll be here as events continue to unfold. And you can scan the QR code for our apps. And until then, I'm Ladar Lazi. Thank you for watching and stay safe.
Welcome back to Axis of Truth. Another week here in Israel, another week running to bomb shelters as the war against the Islamic regime continues. And while Iranians are risking their lives and even celebrating when the regime's military infrastructure is hit, you'd never know that from much of the media in the United States and the UK. That's why to kick off the show today, we're going through some of the greatest hits of this war so far in the international media. This is a parade of some of the most distorted, morally confused, and absurd media coverage that we've seen in years. And that's saying a lot given we just survived October 7th a few years ago. Let's start with CNN. Now, this week, CNN aired 4 minutes straight of Mojtaba Khamenei speaking directly from Islamic Republic State Television, a regime media network that's currently under sanctions by the United States. No pushback or context was given, just straight propaganda from a government that spent decades funding terrorism and killing Americans. Now, you may have also heard by now that CNN sent a reporter into Iran with the permission of the regime itself, which means that every second of that reporting that was taking place under government supervision, and it was with their permission. But the absurdity didn't stop there for CNN. Christiane Amanpour ran a segment about the Iran-Iraq war in which the Islamic regime sent children across minefields as human shields. Now, thousands of children were given plastic keys and sent to walk across landmines so that soldiers wouldn't have to. This is one of the most horrific crimes in the regime's history, and there's a lot of crimes. But instead of presenting this as a war crime against children, the segment framed it as a symbol of national devotion and love for the regime. Children being sent to their deaths was presented as a heartwarming story. Check this out.
President Trump called for Iran's military to lay down its arms or face certain death. But he and his war planners had failed to understand or remember the strong religious fervor that commits millions to face death in the name of their faith and guarding their Islamic revolution. So we dug into the archives to find In the Name of God, the incredible series based on exclusive footage acquired by CNN in the 80s at the height of the Iran-Iraq war. In this piece, we see a boy, Mohammed, at the very most 17 years old, probably younger, who was recruited for the front by Iran's paramilitary, the Basij. His family bid him a fond farewell, knowing that he would likely be martyred, for one of these children's missions would be acting as human minesweepers.
These kids just received 2 weeks training, and just how to shoot with the guns and send them to battlefield, using them for the minefield to destroy it.
Landmines have been the focus of much outcry in this war, specifically the use of human minesweepers, waves of young volunteers going to their deaths, paving the way for tanks that are in short supply.
And if that wasn't enough, Amanpour then hosted Reza Aslan, who confidently declared that Iranians are now rallying around the flag in support of the regime. Take a look.
When death starts raining down from the skies, what tends to happen is that people rally to their government regardless of how much they hate their government.
Really, that same old tired and disproven trope? Because the images we actually see coming from Iranians in the streets of Iran and across the diaspora show something very, very different. The flag the Iranians are waving isn't the flag of the Islamic Republic. It's the lion and sun flag, the flag of Iran before the 1979 revolution, the symbol of Iran, the Iran they hope to rebuild after the regime is gone. But if you watched that segment, you would never know that. And CNN wasn't the only outlet having a bad week. Over at Haaretz, the paper ran a profile of Ali Larijani with the remarkable headline, "Ruthless Leader, Brilliant Philosopher Ali Larijani, Iran's Most Powerful Man." Brilliant philosopher? This is the same regime official who has been sanctioned and plays a central role in the regime's oppression of Iranians as well as terror activities. Instead of presenting him as one of the architects of that repression, the article portrayed him as some sort of intellectual statesman to humanize his image. Over in the UK, Channel 4 continued the embarrassing war reporting by claiming that Israel had shut down access to Al-Aqsa Mosque during Ramadan for Muslims. Except that's not at all what happened. The restrictions in question were Home Front Command civil defense guidelines that apply to everyone in Israel during periods of heavy ballistic missile fire. They require people to remain within a certain distance of a bomb shelter, and they prohibit large gatherings, to prevent mass casualties in war. And yet somehow the report framed it as a religious persecution. But perhaps the most morally disturbing example this week came after the attempted terror attack on a Jewish school in Michigan. On March 12th, the Lebanese-American man rammed a vehicle packed with explosives into Temple Israel in West Bloomfield, Michigan. Now, the building contained a preschool with more than 140 children inside at the time. 140 children were in that building. Now, in somewhat of a miracle, the attacker was killed after security responded and prevented what could have been a terrible mass casualty terror attack. But instead of universal condemnation, what we're seeing in response from some parts of the media is something else entirely. On GV News, for example, commentator Angelina McCahey suggested that the synagogue may have been targeted because it aligns with Israel and because Israel is in its name. Check this out.
Have these attacks been predominantly against Jewish targets?
Well, I can't really speak on that directly. I can say that this situation, this was an Israeli temple. It was aligned with Israel. I will say that.
A Jewish temple?
A Jewish temple.
Jewish synagogue is not an Israeli temple.
It's called the Real Israel Temple.
They're Jewish.
Okay.
They're the people of Israel.
How do you? So I just finish my point. So
it was wrong from the premise. They're not Israeli. They're Jewish.
So they're called the Real Israeli Temple, yes, and they do align with Israel and their beliefs. So this attack. Also, what we found out from the guy who attacked them was that he did have family in Lebanon that was killed from strikes, and that was confirmed. We don't know whether or not who those family members were, but it was posted on social media, his social media, the night prior to the attack, that it was actually his family and his kids that were killed.
I'm almost speechless in response to the level of stupidity here. Think about how insane that argument is. First off, to be so insanely ignorant that you don't understand a synagogue called Temple Israel has nothing to do with the modern day state of Israel. And second, to bring that up as if it's somehow relevant or mitigating when someone drives a truck full of explosives into a children's school in America because they are Jews. What year are we living in? Also, bringing up the fact that he has relatives who died in Lebanon is completely irrelevant, but even more so when you understand that his family are in Hezbollah, and his brother was actually a Hezbollah commander. So it's not at all surprising since Hezbollah has been attacking Israelis nonstop since joining the war. This isn't analysis. It's an attempt to remove responsibility from the terrorist and shift it to the victim. And yes, holding American Jews responsible for the policies of a country thousands of miles away that they don't even live in is anti-Semitism. Sadly, the moral confusion didn't stop there this week. The New York Times ran headlines that sounded less like reporting on a terrorist attack and more like a character profile. A restaurant worker was a quiet presence. Then he attacked a synagogue. In other words, the story wasn't the terrorist trying to massacre Jewish children. The story was humanizing the terrorist. And if you wonder where Angelina on GB News got this idiotic idea about Temple Israel, well, look how the New York Times titled the story about this synagogue. Temple Israel was founded in 1941, dedicated to the formation of a Jewish state. What? A house of worship in Michigan's defining trait is being dedicated to forming a Jewish state? Unfortunately, this same narrative of how the terrorist family members were killed in Lebanon was also pushed by Dropsite News, a media network funded through Soros-connected networks, which amplified stories designed to generate sympathy for the attacker, a narrative that was quickly echoed by useful idiots like Megyn Kelly. Now, the most insane part about all of this, though, is that even if the synagogue was owned by the Israeli government and was full of IDF soldiers, so what? You still don't have a right to drive a truck full of explosives into a house of worship. Why are we even debating this? Only when it comes to anti-Semitic attacks, we hear this endless excuse-making and posturing, oh, Israel, shut up already. This is how extremism gets normalized, not through open support of terrorism, but through the slow introduction of excuses. And this problem doesn't stop with mainstream media. A recent analysis found that many of the most viral posts from this war pushing anti-American and anti-Israel narratives are not even coming from American accounts. They're coming from networks of accounts operating outside the United States that are coordinating to push these narratives into Western audiences. In other words, while Iranians are risking their lives to fight the regime, the information environment in the West is being flooded with completely distorted narratives that serve the regime's interests. And when you step back and look at this entire week of coverage, whether social media or media, the most extraordinary thing is not what's happening in Iran. The most extraordinary thing is how badly much of the Western media is failing to cover it. Because the biggest obstacle to understanding what's happening right now isn't a lack of information. It's the way that information is being presented to you in America. Beyond understanding evil, however, there are other consequences of this disinformation campaign. And while some media figures are busy humanizing the Islamic regime or minimizing the threat that it posed, the real-world consequences are already paying out across multiple continents with small-scale terror attacks and anti-Semitic violence. According to data from the Combat Antisemitism movement, global anti-Semitic incidents increased by 34% just the first week of the war. Out of 154 incidents recorded worldwide, 73 were linked directly to the war in Iran, with perpetrators motivated by support for the regime or by conspiracy theories blaming Jews and Israel for the conflict. And that surge isn't just online hate. It's showing up in real-world attacks. Take the United States. In the terror attack in Michigan, Ayman Mohammed Ghazali targeted Temple Israel, which is a major synagogue in the area that also houses that Jewish preschool I mentioned, where 140 children and staff were inside the building. The only reason that a major massacre didn't take place is because of a heroic security guard who succeeded in stopping him before he could reach the children. But that wasn't the only incident in the United States, tragically. In Austin, Texas, a gunman opened fire in a mass shooting that killed 2 people and wounded 14 others. Investigators found he was wearing a shirt reading "Property of Allah" and an undershirt with the flag of the Islamic Republic. Authorities also found Iranian symbols in his possession. In New York City, 2 men named Amir Balat and Ibrahim Qayoumi were arrested after throwing an IED into a crowd during a protest near Gracie Mansion, the residence of the mayor of New York. Now, federal investigators say the men were inspired by ISIS and even discussed carrying out what they called an attack even larger than the Boston Marathon bombing. Now in San Jose, California, 2 Jewish men speaking Hebrew were violently assaulted at a restaurant, with the attacker shouting, "Don't mess with Iran," and other anti-Semitic slurs as he beat them. So in 1 week, you have a Hezbollah-connected attack on a synagogue in Michigan, a mass shooting in Texas with Iranian symbolism, an ISIS-inspired IED attack attempt in New York, and a violent anti-Semitic assault in California. In Canada, the situation is even worse. Not only has Canada become a front line in the regime's campaign of anti-Semitic attacks, with 3 different synagogues being fired at last week, but there's also been intimidation and violence against Iranian dissidents abroad, to the point that Canada really cannot protect them. Earlier this month, Canadian police arrested 2 suspects who are now being charged with first-degree murder in the killing of an Iranian dissident, Masoud Masjoudi, a former instructor at Simon Fraser University, who had been reported missing in Burnaby, British Columbia. Now, investigators said that Masjoudi's disappearance wasn't random and treated it as a targeted homicide from the start. The suspects identified by police are Mehdi Ahmadzadeh Razavi and Arizu Sultani, both from the Vancouver area. Now, they're facing first-degree murder charges in connection with his death, but the case has raised alarm amongst Iranians inside of Canada, as well as lawmakers who have raised alarms for years about the IRGC networks and its associates operating inside Canada. They're monitoring and intimidating members of the Iranian diaspora. Now, across Europe, we're seeing similar patterns. In the UK, dissidents have been beaten by regime thugs at protests, and anti-Semitic attacks are also growing. In Belgium, an explosion damaged a synagogue in what authorities called a targeted anti-Semitic incident. In Rotterdam, a synagogue was targeted in an arson attack. In Amsterdam, an explosive device was detonated outside a Jewish school, which the officials described after the fact as a deliberate attack against the Jewish community. Security services are also investigating incidents around synagogues in Oslo and Trondheim, both in Norway, where suspicious individuals were arrested near Jewish institutions. And these attacks are not random. A new extremist group calling itself Ashab al-Yamin, or the Companions of the Right, has claimed responsibility for some of these attacks, including the incidents in Belgium and the most recent one in the Netherlands just a few days ago. The group appeared suddenly this week and released videos calling for attacks against Jewish targets. Now, what's particularly concerning is that these videos were distributed through Telegram channels that are associated with the Shiite Axis network of groups that are linked to Hezbollah and the IRGC, raising obvious questions about whether this new organization is connected to the Islamic Republic's proxy network. And that's exactly what security services have been warning about for years. The IRGC has built a global network of proxies, militias, ideological supporters that can operate far beyond Iran's borders. They're networks that target Jewish communities and Iranian dissidents, and ultimately anyone who challenges the regime. So when people claim that this war is just a regional conflict that has nothing to do with the West, that it's not our war, the events of this week tell a very different story. The synagogue attack in Michigan, the mass shooting in Texas, an IED attack in New York, gunshots at 3 separate synagogues in Canada, a murdered Iranian dissident, a violent anti-Semitic assault in California, a synagogue bombing in Belgium, an arson attack in Rotterdam, an explosive device targeting a Jewish school in Amsterdam, and suspicious activity around 2 more synagogues in Norway. It's not random. It's the global shadow of a regime that has spent 47 years building proxy cells and other terror networks across multiple continents. And the events of this week show exactly how far those networks can reach. But there is another front in this conflict that often receives far less attention than it should. It's the war that the Islamic Republic has been waging against its own athletes for decades. And this week, we saw another example of that system in action. As I talked about last week, several members of Iran's women's national football team competing at the Women's Asian Cup in Australia defected after refusing to sing the national anthem of the regime before their match and then getting threatened by the regime immediately after. Now, in the days since then, some of the players who initially sought protection in Australia have reversed course and are now returning to Iran after reports of intense pressure on them, their families, and threats from the regime. Now, those who were working on this case did confirm that the players were most likely coerced and that their families back in Iran were being pressured, which is a method that that government has repeatedly used against athletes, journalists, and activists. In other words, even when Iranian athletes are thousands of miles away, the regime still has ways of reaching them. The West is unable to protect many of these dissidents. Part of the reason is because they've allowed the IRGC to build up a presence in so many of these countries. And this repression of athletes, it's hardly a new phenomenon. In 2020, the regime executed Navid Afkari, a champion wrestler who had participated in anti-regime protests in 2018. They executed him after brutal torture and despite international pressure. The year before that, we saw Iranian judoka Saeed Molaei fled the country after being ordered by government officials in Iran to withdraw from the World Championships so that he wouldn't have to face off against Israeli judoka Sagi Muki. Now, this policy of forcing athletes to boycott Israeli opponents has been documented for many years across multiple sports, including judo, wrestling, boxing, and weightlifting. Athletes who refuse to follow those orders risk their careers or worse. One of the most prominent defectors is Kimia Alizadeh, who was Iran's first ever women's Olympic medalist in Taekwondo. Alizadeh later left the country and announced that she couldn't represent a system that used athletes as political propaganda while denying women basic rights. She competed for the Olympic refugee team instead in 2020. Now, this history of repression against athletes in Iran actually goes back much further. In 1988, Forzun Abdi, the captain of the women's national volleyball team, was executed after spending years in prison for opposing the regime. That same year, Mashid Varzagi, a member of the Olympic soccer team, was executed for distributing anti-government newspapers. And in 1981, Olympic wrestler for the country of Iran was executed alongside 29 other political prisoners. The list goes on and on. This history, is not just about individual cases. It's about a system where the Islamic Republic uses sport as a tool of political propaganda and ideological control. They've even used international sporting events to normalize and sanitize their security apparatus. At the Tokyo Olympics, Iranian gold medal winning shooter Javad Foroughi won a gold medal while also being a member of the IRGC who served the regime in Syria. But the truth is that the entire structure of sports organizations in Iran is closely tied to the regime itself. The current head of the Iranian Olympic Committee, Mahmoud Khosrovi-Vafa, has served in the IRGC and was even a former bodyguard of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. In other words, the institution that's supposed to represent Iranian athletes in the Olympic movement is directly connected to the same power structure that controls the country politically. And this is one of the reasons why a growing group of Iranian athletes and human rights advocates have launched a campaign calling for the dissolution of the Iranian Olympic Committee. In open letters sent to the International Olympic Committee, athletes document how the Iranian sports system operates under government control. They describe a structure in which athletes are monitored, threatened, and forced to follow state ideology, including the policy of boycotting competing against Israeli athletes. Now, this system violates the core principles of the Olympic Charter, which require sport to be free from political discrimination as well as government interference. As long as the current structure remains in place, Iranian athletes are going to continue to face intimidation and political pressure. And this issue is not limited to athletes because the regime even polices its own fans. Inside Iran, women are still forbidden from attending football matches, and there have been multiple incidents in which women were even assaulted, beaten, or pepper sprayed by security forces for trying to enter stadiums. Sport in Iran isn't just sport, it's a political system. And given the history, there's an increasingly strong argument that Iranian athletes should not be forced to compete under the flag of the regime that controls that system. The international community has already taken a similar approach in other cases. Russian athletes, for example, were allowed to compete, but only as neutral athletes under a blank flag rather than representing the Russian state. The same principle can and should apply here. Because if sport is supposed to represent fair competition and human dignity, then Iranian athletes themselves need to be protected from the political system that controls them. And now it's time for this week's Good, Bad, and Ugly, which we're doing in reverse order so we can end on a positive note. So this week, the ugly story goes to the regime's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, who sat down with CBS host Margaret Brennan and declared that the reason he has internet is because he's the voice of the Iranian people. Can't make this up. Take a look.
I just do want to point out, you're speaking to us via Zoom. The Iranian people don't have open internet access, but you do. Why?
Well, because I'm the voice of Iranians, and I have to defend their right. So this is why I have access to internet to just have our voice being heard by the international community. But internet is closed because of the security reasons, because we are under attack, we are under aggression, and we have to do everything to protect our people. In any country, there are, urgent measures taken for the sake of war.
Protect your people? Are you kidding me? You just murdered 40,000 of them. But according to Aragchi, he, being the regime, speaks for the Iranian people. Now, in ordinary circumstances, that claim might be more laughable than anything else, but right now it's particularly absurd because at the very moment that Aragchi was making that claim on American television, the Islamic Republic has shut down the internet access across Iran for nearly 2 weeks. 92 million people completely cut off from the world. Iranians inside the country have been desperately trying to connect through Starlink, also punishable by death, or through other internet filtering workarounds and VPNs, simply to communicate with family members abroad. So the government, cutting off an entire country from the internet, now wants the American public to believe that it's the voice of the people? Are you serious? If the regime actually represented the Iranian people, it wouldn't need to shut down the internet every time there's a crisis. It wouldn't need to silence the public or control information. But the internet blackout actually tells you and the entire world everything we need to know. The Islamic Republic isn't afraid of foreign governments. It's afraid of its own people. And Abbas Araghchi certainly doesn't speak for them. And now let's move on to the bad story of the week. And this one goes to Tucker Carlson, which could be for many reasons, even this week. But I want to hone in on one. This week, Carlson pushed another ridiculous claim about the Middle East that was shot down by none other than his favorite country, Qatar. Carlson bluntly told his audience that Saudi Arabia and Qatar had arrested Mossad agents who were supposedly plotting bombings inside those countries. He presented this claim as evidence that Israel was secretly destabilizing the region, like everything else he claims. Check it out.
It really, really hurts these countries. And Israel wanted to hurt these countries. That's the point. Wanted to hurt these countries. Wanted to sow chaos and disorder because they are rivals of Israel. So it's probably hasn't been reported, but it's a fact that last night in Qatar and Saudi Arabia, authorities arrested Mossad agents planning on committing bombings in those countries. Now, that's weird. That doesn't make any sense. Why would the Israelis be committing bombings in 2 Gulf countries, which are also being attacked by Iran? Aren't they on the same side? No. Israel wants to hurt Iran and Qatar and UAE, and Saudi, and Bahrain, and Oman, and Kuwait.
There's just one problem. The governments involved say that didn't happen. Qatar's foreign ministry publicly rejected the claim and said it had no information about any Mossad operatives being arrested in the country. And what Qatar did announce was something very, very different. Authorities said they detained 10 individuals connected to a network linked to the IRGC. Now, according to reports, the cell was suspected of conducting surveillance and sabotage operations connected to Iranian security services. In other words, the actual story was about Iranian operatives, not Mossad. And this matters because the IRGC, as we've spoken about, has spent decades building proxy networks across the region. Gulf states like Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE have all accused the Islamic Republic of running militant cells and espionage networks inside their borders. Instead of pointing this out, Carlson is again scapegoating Israel with zero evidence and inventing the entire story. That's not just a small error. It fits a pattern that we've seen since before this war even began from Tucker Carlson. Whether it's commentators, activists, or social media personalities, there's a constant effort to shift focus away from the regime in Tehran and towards some supposed Western or Israeli conspiracy. But when you actually look at the facts, the threat networks keep leading back to the same place, the Islamic Republic. This entire week was just another example of that. Now, with that said, I want to move to the final story of this week, the good. This one comes from inside Iran because while the regime continues to try to project strength, what we're actually seeing on the ground is something different. Over the past few days, Israeli drones have been targeting IRGC and Basij checkpoints. These are the places used by the regime to control cities and intimidate Iranians, preventing them from protesting. But that's not something that the IDF is going to tolerate anymore. According to information from sources inside Iran, more than a dozen IRGC and Basij checkpoints have been targeted by drone strikes in just the past 2 days. The resulting damage has been severe, with more than 100 regime operatives being killed and many more injured. But the military damage is only part of the story here. The internal reaction inside the regime's security forces is what really matters at this point. Reports from inside Iran indicate that hundreds of Basij operatives are now refusing to report to their checkpoint positions. Others are abandoning their posts altogether. The regime is struggling to keep these units supplied with basic necessities like food, equipment, and some regime forces who do show up are now sleeping in tents because their bases have been destroyed or are considered too dangerous to use. In other cases, they've been seen moving into schools and mosques. And of course, over the weekend, we also saw videos of them moving checkpoints under bridges to hide from the IDF's drones. When these forces are beginning to panic, hide, or desert their posts, it shows the cracks in the regime's ability to control the country. And that's exactly what sources are reporting. At this point, the fall of the regime is really only a matter of time. Well, that's all for this week. We'll be back next week with more updates from across the region and all the latest from the war in Iran. If you have a story that you think I should cover, feel free to reach out to me on social media, Emily K. Schrader, or on Instagram at Emily in Tel Aviv. Until next time, see you right here on Axis of Truth on JNS.
Welcome back to a special edition of ILTV's Weekly Review. Israel and the United States have begun operations inside of Iran in what is being dubbed Operation Roaring Lion. Developments are coming out every day, and we are here to keep you in the loop. Enjoy this special broadcast wrapping all of the top headlines from the past few days.
We have entered the third week of Operation Roaring Lion and Operation Epic Fury, which began with joint U.S. and Israeli strikes on the Islamic Republic of Iran. And on day 16, the war rages on, with Israeli officials now estimating it will take a few more weeks to conclude. There are dramatic developments as the United States and Israel continue striking and degrading the Iranian regime's capabilities while fighting to keep the Strait of Hormuz open. And as Israel continues to receive incoming missile fire throughout the country from both Iran and Lebanon. Meanwhile, the IDF released information marking 2 weeks of the operation and divulging that the Air Force carried out over 7,600 strikes in over 400 waves. About 4,700 strikes have been against the Iranian missile program alone. The Army said thousands of terror operatives have been eliminated as well. It estimated between 4,000 and 5,000 Iranian soldiers had been neutralized, not to mention the senior leadership of the IRGC and the supreme leader himself. Meanwhile, the United States says it has struck over 6,000 targets and sunk dozens of Iranian Navy vessels. And on the northern front, is Israel heading towards war or towards a potential historic peace treaty with Lebanon that could include official recognition of the State of Israel? It's day 17 of the war with Iran. The IDF says the campaign against the Islamic regime being carried out with the United States is moving faster than expected, but will still take about 3 weeks of attacks. In the past 24 hours, the IDF hit some 200 western and central Iranian military sites. ILTV's Steve Leibovitz has the latest.
The IDF says Iran cannot currently produce new missiles after extensive strikes on its defense industry in central and western Iran, 200 in the past day alone. The IDF is preparing for at least 3 more weeks of operations, with thousands of additional targets still identified across Iran.
יש לנו תוכנית לחימה סדורה ומתוכננת היטב. יש לנו עוד אלפי מטרות באיראן, ואנחנו מייצרים מטרות נוספות מדי יום. המשטר כבר מוחלש, ואנחנו ממשיכים להחליש אותו יותר ויותר מדי יום.
The most recent targets included command centers that were manned by Iranian soldiers, air defense systems, and weapons storage and production sites. The IDF said it's expanding strikes across western and central Iran to systematically damage the regime's command and control capabilities. Footage released by the army shows UAV launch squads and missile teams fleeing struck sites, with Israeli aircraft tracking and eliminating the operatives in real time. The army says these operations are designed to reduce missile and drone fire toward Israel and continue non-stop to destroy the regime's ballistic missile and UAV infrastructure. The target of many strikes were command centers of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and the besieged paramilitary force. Officials say they are seeing signs of declining morale among Iranian forces as the strikes continue, but the army also cautions it's not its role to bring regime change.
כצבא אין לנו מטרה להפיל משטר, אנחנו לא מפילים משטר, אנחנו כן יוצרים את התנאים ומערערים אותו כדי שלאורך זמן העם האיראני ייקח את גורלו בידו ויקח אליו חזרה את המדינה הזאת שנלקחה כבת ערובה בידי משטר הטרור הזה.
IDF strikes in Iran are now expected to continue for another 3 weeks. The job is to destroy the threat to Israel. It will be up to the Iranian people to rise up and rid themselves of their tyrannical regime.
Turning to Iran, where overnight an IDF strike killed besieged paramilitary force commander Gholamreza Soleimani, Defense Minister Israel Katz says top Iranian official and Secretary of the National Security Council Ali Larijani was also targeted and killed. Earlier waves of Air Force attacks destroyed both the Iranian Navy Command Center as well as the Center for the Development of Satellite Attack Capabilities. ILTV's Steve Leibowitz has the latest.
The overnight strike killed the notorious Basij paramilitary force commander Gholamreza Soleimani and targeted other top figures in the Basij, which is known for violently suppressing anti-regime protests. The IDF confirms it also struck top Iranian official Ali Larijani in Tehran, but results are still being verified. Simultaneously, the military targeted top Palestinian Islamic Jihad leader Akram al-Ajuri and other senior figures with confirmation of casualties pending. On day 18 of the war with Iran, the IDF attacked and destroyed both the Iranian Naval Command Center as well as the Center for the Development of Satellite Attack Capabilities. The Army spokesman detailed specific strikes in Iran, illustrating the airstrike that hit Iran's Navy headquarters.
הטייסים והטייסות שלנו תוקפים ברחבי איראן כל הזמן. ביממה האחרונה פגענו במפקדת חיל הים של משמרות המהפכה. המשטר האיראני השתמש במפקדה הזו כדי להפוך את הזירה הימית לזירת טרור.
The IDF also confirmed the Israeli Air Force strike on the key Iranian Space Agency research site used to develop capabilities to attack satellites.
בתקיפה נוספת בלב טהרן פגענו והשמדנו מרכז לפיתוח יכולות תקיפת לוויינים. מרכז שהיווה איום על נכסי החלל והלוויינות של ישראל ושל כל העולם. במקביל אנחנו ממשיכים לתקוף את כוחות הבסיג', כוחות הדיכוי האיראנים.
Israel says its airstrikes across Iran target military and terror leaders, sending a clear warning that the campaign will continue until the threat is neutralized.
And joining us now with the latest on Operation Roaring Lion, now 3 weeks into the war, is Colonel Miri Eisen, Senior Fellow at the International Institute for Counterterrorism. Thank you so much for joining us.
As always, glad to be here.
So a lot of incredible accomplishments for the United States and for Israel. What is your assessment of the war now that it's entering its 3rd week?
One of the things that happens after such a long time is that we feel as if it's stagnant. But that has to do just with the fact that, yes, you're tired, I'm tired. There are still those single missiles that Iran is managing to fire at Israel. But let's be clear. The Islamic regime over the last 3 weeks, we can see the clear deterioration in the sense that they cannot fire the rockets that they want to. The numbers are down. That has to do with the actions taken by the Israeli Defense Forces, by the U.S. forces. against launchers, against the different sites. We're hearing more and more about people deserting their different sites because they understand that they are going to be attacked. If a missile launcher is used against us, that immediately puts off that kind of footage that you're showing right now. Afterwards, they're going to go and attack that launcher. So it's taking it step by step. It takes a really long breath to be able to withstand all of this, but I do see that we are doing in such a way much better than before, and it is having a long-term effect.
Now, we heard from U.S. President Donald Trump, who said recently that Israel and the United States have different objectives in the war. It's really the first time we've heard any kind of hint at sort of a potential daylight or different sort of objectives in this war between Washington and Jerusalem. At the same time, Trump said the war would continue as long as necessary. I mean, what do you make of this?
To me, from the beginning, we always have to remember, and Lidar, I think sometimes we forget this, the United States of America is a world power. The United States of America has a military unlike any other. Yes, we're Israel. We're certainly a regional power, and we've shown enormous capabilities over these last 2.5 weeks, almost 3 weeks. But when we talk about it at the end, the United States is looking at the entire world. We're looking right now at Israel within our borders. We are being attacked directly, cross-border attacks from Hezbollah and Lebanon into Israel. We are directly being attacked by the Islamic regime from Iran into Israel. So that's always going to have that difference, and I don't see it as a bad thing. The United States is the world power. They are the lead in that sense. What's happening in the Straits of Hormuz absolutely impacts the entire world economy, not just Israel. We are much more disturbed about our existential threats, the Islamic regime and its continuity, and Hezbollah holding all of those weapons that they received from the Islamic regime of Iran and using them against us.
And so let's talk a little bit about the capabilities today of the Islamic regime and of Hezbollah. I mean, what is the status of the regime's capabilities? Because, you know, we keep hearing it's being degraded. As you said, it's taking time. Yet we are still seeing this missile fire into Israel. Maybe not as dramatic on such a grand scale enough, you know, but still enough to send millions into bomb shelters.
So nobody wants to have statistics, but at the end, statistics matter. Why? Because they still have, let's say, hundreds, maybe even thousands of missiles left, not launchers. They've been attacking the launchers, but they still probably have some 100 launchers left. That means that with a launcher, they can fire one at 2:30 a.m. and at 5:30 a.m. and at 10:30 a.m. That's only 3 out of the 100 launchers out of the 1,000 missiles, which means it gives them a very long capability to do this extensively. It's the term that we call attrition war. Israel certainly wants to avoid that. There's a difference between the attrition war, which is what Iran would like to be at, and between the fact that they're always going to have a few missiles left. We want to be sure that they can't use them one by one whenever they want. You attack the launchers, you go after them. So yes, they have capabilities. It's not large numbers, but because of the way that they're pacing them, they can use them for quite a long time.
Now, do you see an end to this war in sight? You know, a lot of people are talking about an exit strategy. Is there an exit strategy? Isn't there? In your opinion, is there a clear exit strategy or an end to this war in sight?
When you start a campaign, you don't necessarily know exactly when it ends. There's the other side, and look at what the other side did. Iran, yes, absolutely, we attacked their military targets, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, all of the places that they were preparing for the proxies and for themselves, the annihilation, destruction of the state of Israel. But what Iran did is went and attacked everywhere, Lidar. I mean, they've attacked Oman and Bahrain, United Arab Emirates and Kuwait, Qatar and Saudi Arabia, Iraq and Jordan, Turkey, Cyprus, Azerbaijan. Every time I say all of these places, Iran chose to attack them. I don't know that anybody before this started thought that Iran's response would be to attack all of the countries in the greater Middle East and beyond. And that immediately means that this war doesn't look the exact same as when you started it. You're still targeting the same targets. That aim is the same. From the beginning, I've questioned the capability of the air campaign, which is what's being done for the change of regime. But I still think that is absolutely a goal. I just don't think it can be achieved by the air campaign. What the air campaign does is it greatly weakens the central government, their capability to rule, their capability to send out those internal police that murdered 30,000 people at the end of December and during January in protests against them. So again, one stage at a time. We want it to be clear end game. I think that the military targets are clear. I think that the change of regime is something that not only takes time, but you don't do it from an air campaign. You hope that they have the oomph, they have the capability to do it from within.
And I want to pivot now to talk about Lebanon and Iran's terror proxy, Hezbollah. You know, there's a lot of talk about what's happening there. Do you think Israel is heading towards war with Lebanon, towards a ground invasion? Or are we heading towards a historic peace treaty?
One of the interesting things on coming here on a Sunday is that it could be either. Right now, Hezbollah is hand in hand with its patron, with the one that gives it its ideology, its training, its weapons, and that is the Islamic regime. They chose, again, just like Iran chose to go and attack dozen different countries that have nothing to do with what's going on right now, Hezbollah chose to attack Israel. Hezbollah made a clear choice when they did that, Lidar. They said, we are going with the Islamic regime of Iran and not with Lebanon, the country that we live in, that we're born in, the Arabic that we speak. Lebanon as a country, their own leadership have spoken out clearly and said what Hezbollah is doing is not just against the law, they outlawed them. They've actually had quite clear voices against Hezbollah. That's why you have both the opening for dialogue. The president of Lebanon, as you can see, spoke openly and said, I'm willing to sit down at the table, willing to talk with the Israelis. Yes, he wants us to immediately stop fighting. But that's the opening to something that we haven't ever heard from a Lebanese president. But hand in hand, what am I supposed to say right now to my friends who live up on the northern border, who are being attacked as we speak by Hezbollah rockets, all of them arriving from Iran, and the Lebanese don't do anything against that. So there's talk and there's hope. I really hope that we go forward with this dialogue, but we can't stop right now defending the north against this threat of Hezbollah.
Absolutely. So still a lot of threats remain. The war continues, but it's looking good. Colonel Miri Eisen, thank you so much for joining us and for your analysis today.
Thank you so much.
And not just Iran. On the north